Enhances efforts to enhance tourism in the country. Focus now turns to wildlife security. And we have Yusuf Wato, wildlife ecologist from the World Wildlife Fund, well known as WWF, that is World Wildlife Fund for Nature. Quite a tongue twister. Yusuf, welcome. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So
Yusuf.
let's begin with wildlife security. And of course, this conversation is informed by the fact that there are two rhinos that were killed in Meru National Park. Was it yesterday or a day before yesterday? So this begs the question: if these wildlife are being killed in a protected area like national parks, conservancies, then where will that leave the other animals, perhaps that are roaming free?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. Let me first of all try to break down the issues of poaching. There are different categories of poaching, and this depends on the motivation of the poachers themselves.
Yeah.
One is people who kill wildlife because of subsistence, for just survival.
Yeah.
And there are many communities in Kenya who are hunters and gatherers, and they do wildlife poaching for that reason. The second category is wildlife poaching for trade. It's called bushmeat, and specifically targets small species such as impalas, buffaloes, giraffes, etc. And that goes beyond just subsistence, but for commercial purposes. And thirdly, and the one which is now threatening some of the endangered species like rhinos and elephants, is poaching for commercial trade.
For ivory and the rest.
For ivory, for rhino horn, for elephant tusk, etc.
And I understand there's a very huge demand, especially in the areas surrounding China, the Philippines there. So what is the government doing to make sure that this does not take place? Because it keeps on recurring. Two rhinos, I mean, these are endangered species that have been killed just a day or two ago in Meru.
Exactly. So the incident in Meru that happened on Wednesday is unfortunate. It's actually two adult rhinos and one calf. And when you look at poaching, poaching is actually driven by international criminal threat. It plays in the leagues of, for example, drugs and narcotics or human trafficking is as big as that. And as much as we look at animals that are, for example, killed in protected areas like Kenya or other countries in Africa, what drives this trade is actually the availability of markets, for example, in Asia, in Hong Kong, etc. And in that part of the world, people believe that ivory and rhino horn has some medicinal value, which is actually a misconception because, in fact, the material that makes the rhino horn and ivory is actually the same as what we have as nails. So if basically you remove your nails and fuse them together, you have rhino horn.
And that informs why there's a very huge demand out there.
Absolutely.
Yusuf, let's talk about the bush meat poaching, which is said to be some sort of a multi-billion shillings kind of a market. And there are conservancies out there who are engaging in hunting, I believe. So what kind of a message are they sending out there to the public?
Yeah, so one of the things that drives poaching, and especially bushmeat poaching, is issues of, poverty or either communities not being involved in these protected areas, or maybe the benefits that come from these protected areas do not get to the communities. And one of the ways to approach this, and I think the long-term approach, is basically to try and make Kenyans understand that wildlife conservation is an important land use or economic activity, just like agriculture, just like, livestock business, etc. So we need to ensure that these protected areas, which in fact generate a lot of money for Kenyans. As we speak now, over 800 Kenyans are employed in tourism industry, and tourists in Kenya is driven by wildlife.
800,000 people.
800,000 Kenyans.
Yes.
And we are looking at about $1 billion in terms of revenue that comes from this tourism driven by wildlife. And that is less than 10% of the potential that tourism has in terms of generation of revenue.
That's a huge source of foreign money. So this begs the questions once again. Why is it so hard to end poaching? Do you believe there's a political goodwill, perhaps?
Yeah, when you look at the trends of poaching in Kenya, in the last 5 years alone, Kenya has been able to, the Kenyan authorities plus non-governmental organizations and all those who are playing in this space of wildlife conservation have been able to reduce rhino poaching by 85%.
Yes.
Last year, Kenya lost 9 rhinos only. If you compare that, for example, with a country like South Africa, that lost about 1,000 rhinos in 1 year.
That's a huge number for a country like South Africa, because people tend to believe they have much more technology, but people continue hunting down these endangered species.
Absolutely. So poaching is really not a job that can be done by only one institution. If you look at, for example, a protected area like Tsavo National Park, it's 11,000 square kilometers, and wildlife roam, in this big space. You need to have a lot of rangers, you need to have appropriate technology, but also the communities who are living around these protected areas must be able to own this wildlife and be able to give, intelligence information. One thing, Yusuf, that I need to also emphasize is that once these animals are poached, they have to get through some exit point, whether it is, the ports or the airports, the roadblocks on the roads, and therefore, concerted effort needs to be done by not just, for example, Kenya Wildlife Service. The police are supposed to be involved. The Kenya Port Authority is supposed to be involved. There needs to be political goodwill to be able to stop this
I think
poaching menace.
that's where corruption comes in. And there are people who are saying, I don't want you to be political, but they're also saying the poaching cartels are linked to some powerful individuals, within government, within the political class. And that is why, even with the stringent measures within our immigration department, these products find its way into the market. That is China and these other countries.
Indeed, there is a lot of motivation for these wildlife products. If you look at, for example, the cost of a kilogram of a rhino horn, it would go for not anything less than, for example, $25,000 per kilogram. So the motivation for a poacher to be able to kill these animals and to transport them out of this country to these markets then become very, very huge, so that they are ready to also lose their lives. And of course, there are also other businessmen who, look at this as a lucrative business. Therefore, I think to address poaching, there needs to be a very, strong political will. There has to be legal framework that, for example, a poacher who is caught with trophies from these endangered species should either, should be fined really very high fines. Kenya has done very well in this front, and if you're caught with rhino horn, for example, you get 20 million Kenya shillings in terms of fine, or even life imprisonment. But the question is, do these cases, go through our courts, and do these poachers get these fines and get imprisoned?
Most of the cases, that doesn't happen.
Absolutely.
And that is why I brought out the issue of the political will, whether it's there or not. Now, let's talk about the continent and how the future of wildlife, especially endangered species like rhino, looks like. I believe just the other day, was it 2 or 3 days ago, there's some 6 or 7 rhinos that were transported from South Africa to Chad, I believe. It's a country that has never seen a rhino since 1970s. So how does the future of these endangered species look like in the continent?
I think a lot of work needs to be done. Countries like Central Africa have already, cleared all the rhinos. Rhinos have gone extinct in those countries. Kenya and Southern African countries hold most of the population of rhinos in Africa, but even then, these populations are being threatened by poaching, as we see. So unless a lot of resources are pumped into conservation of this wildlife, unless a multi-stakeholder approach is taken into account, so that we ensure that these animals are safe, the future of wildlife is really in great danger. But I think there is a lot of effort that is being done in Kenya right now. Of course, we have maintained less than 1% of rhino mortality in the last 5 years. The case that we've had about rhino poaching in Meru is the first in this year, is the first incident in this year, meaning that we've been able to repulse, these poachers. But I think a lot needs to be done. There has to be very good political will. I want to give an example of a country, Nepal, which has achieved zero poaching of, their elephants and rhinos. And when you look at the framework that they employ, the Prime Minister sits in the committee that ensures that, wildlife authorities in those countries are well-resourced they have proper technology, and communities also get a lot of benefit. I think that kind of approach will be able to help conservation of wildlife in this country.
Dr. Yusuf, one final question. In the space of conservation, I'm sure many Kenyans would like to know what WWF is doing.
Thank you very much. WWF has been in this country since 1960, and the vision of WWF is to have an environment which, is good for wildlife, but also contributes to the economy and the livelihood of Kenyans. We work very closely with institutions that are in this space, whether it is the forestry sector, energy sector, etc. And at the moment now, there is this movement called the Keep Kenya Breathing. And we are trying to ensure that Kenya gets to 10% of forest cover by 2050. And that is what we are calling all Kenyans to be able to participate, so that we have our waters flowing, our rivers, and our energy, which depends on hydroelectric
And of
power.
course, the forest cover is going to help the wildlife as well.
Absolutely, and it's habitat for wildlife as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf Wato, for your input. He is the Wildlife Programs Manager from WWF. And now, speaking of Meru, a county that saw the killing of those two rhinos we've been talking about, we're going to link up with our reporter, Maringa, shortly, and is going to tell us more on some other developments from Meru. Remember, today is the World Firefighters Day. It's also a day that NHIF has set aside as the NHIF Awareness Day. I'm going to link up with the reporter, Maringa, shortly, but before that, News Center is going to take a very short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.